She built a luxury hotel empire from nothing, only to be denied a room in her own creation because of how she looked. What happened next didn't just shake the staff, it shook the entire industry. And she never raised her voice once. No one noticed the black sedan as it pulled up silently to the curb just across from the Bay Crest Hotel in San Francisco. No one paused to watch as the car door opened and a woman stepped out into the cold dusk air. In a city teeming with tourists, professionals, and polished socialites, she barely registered as a blip on the radar. But that was their first mistake. The second was assuming she didn't belong there. She moved slowly, not with the hesitation of age, but with the weight of memory. Her shoes, soft leather, scuffed but well kept, touched the pavement like she was stepping into a cathedral, not a hotel. Her coat, long and plain, swayed with the breeze from the nearby bay. Around her neck was a pale silk scarf, faded from years of wear, wrapped loosely like a quiet protest against the cold. She looked up. There it was, the Bay Crest, rising like a crown above the Embarcadero. Its sweeping architecture and gleaming windows reflected the final rays of sunlight. Inside those windows, champagne sparkled in fluted glasses. Fireplaces crackled softly. Live jazz danced through the lobby. From outside, it looked like perfection. But for her, it wasn't nostalgia. It was unfinished business. Her name was Vivian Cole, and she had built this place. 32 years ago, she stood on the same sidewalk, wearing a thrift store suit and clutching a folder of architectural drafts soaked with her sweat and hope. She'd mortgaged everything to make the Bay Crest Hotel a reality. Every dream, every friendship, every ounce of comfort in her life had been offered up for this temple of hospitality. And it had worked. Against every odd, against the silent disbelief of white investors, against the polite condescension of bankers who said, "You're dreaming too big, Miss Cole." She had done it. But time changes things. Power moves to younger hands. Photos get dusty. Legends fade quietly into rumor. And tonight the legend returned, without announcement, without entourage, without even a suitcase, just a weathered leather handbag, a voice that had once commanded boardrooms, and a heart that carried both triumph and quiet hurt. She stepped through the revolving doors. The warmth of the lobby struck her first, luxurious, golden, designed to impress. Every line, every corner still held echoes of her vision. The chandeliers, the imported marble, the hand-carved mahogany desk. She had chosen all of it once, agonizing over every detail until it felt like a love letter to elegance. No one recognized her. Bellhops walked briskly past. A couple in evening wear checked in beside her, drawing the receptionist's warm smile. Nearby, a concierge bowed slightly as he handed a glass of wine to a man in a navy blazer and gold cufflinks. They were seen. She wasn't. Vivian waited patiently at the front desk, placing her handbag gently on the marble counter. Her fingers brushed the surface, cool and smooth, just as she remembered it. Her eyes moved across the lobby, not with judgment but with quiet observation. She saw what she had created, but more painfully, she saw how she had disappeared from it. The young woman behind the desk didn't look up at first. She was texting, her fingers clicking quickly. Finally, she glanced up, momentarily startled by Vivian's stillness. "Can I help you, ma'am?" she asked politely, but without warmth. "I'd like to check in," Vivian said softly. "There's a suite that should be reserved under my name, Vivian Cole." The receptionist blinked. The name sounded familiar, but didn't match the woman in front of her. No designer purse, no jewelry, no assistant or black car waiting with a door open. The woman looked ordinary, modest, older. She tapped quickly on her keyboard. Her eyes darted between the screen and Vivian's scarf, which was slightly frayed at the edges. I'm sorry, ma'am, she said after a moment, her tone now clipped and overly professional. I don't see any reservation under that name, and unfortunately, we are fully booked this evening. Vivian nodded as if she expected this. That's sweet. Room 2103, it's always reserved for me. Check under permanent house file. The receptionist's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. She tried again. Nothing. I'm very sorry, but there's no record. Perhaps you're thinking of a different location. Vivian smiled gently, but something flickered in her eyes. Not hurt, not surprise. Something older, something she'd learned to hide. No, she said. This is the right place. The receptionist, her name tag read Ava, straightened. She was young, maybe 25, recently out of a hospitality management program, eager to climb the ranks. But she had never been taught how to recognize power that doesn't announce itself. She had only ever seen success in sharp suits and loud watches. To her, Vivian didn't look like success. She looked like someone trying to fake it. I'm sorry, Ava said again, this time with a practiced firmness. Without a reservation or ID verifying your claim, I'm afraid I can't do anything. Vivian stared at her, not with offense, but with something heavier. It was like watching someone repeat history in front of your eyes, and knowing that no matter how much you'd sacrifice to change the world, some things refuse to evolve. Thank you, Vivian said simply and stepped aside. She didn't plead. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. From her handbag, she took out her phone and dialed a number. Hey, it's me. I'm at the Bay Crest. There's been a small oversight. Could you take care of it? It was less than 20 seconds. But by the time she ended the call, the air in the lobby had already begun to shift. Ava, behind the counter, glanced over at her manager's office. Uncertainty flickered in her eyes. She still didn't know who Vivian was. But suddenly, she wasn't so sure that dismissing her had been the right call. Vivian turned away from the desk, her eyes finding the grand staircase that curled upward like an invitation. She remembered watching the first guests walk down those steps on opening night, dressed in tuxedos and evening gowns, the place full of laughter and disbelief that a black woman had pulled off something this extraordinary. Back then, they had smiled to her face while waiting for her to fail. She hadn't. But now, 30 years later, she stood in the lobby of her own creation and felt invisible. The ache that came with that was not new, but it was no less sharp. Two men near the fireplace glanced up from their drinks, whispering behind their hands. A woman near the piano tilted her head, observing the modest woman who'd become the center of subtle curiosity. No one knew who she was, but something about her presence disrupted the polished rhythm of the lobby. Security walked past, slow and aimless, as if unsure whether to intervene. After all, she hadn't done anything. But she didn't look like she belonged either. That was the third mistake. Vivian watched the city lights flicker through the tall windows, her reflection superimposed over the skyline she once conquered. And for a moment she allowed herself to feel it, the absurdity, the sorrow, the strange symmetry of being erased from the place she had given her life to build. They had forgotten her, but they would remember soon enough, not through anger, not through shouting, but through a quiet storm she had mastered long ago, the storm of truth, of dignity, of earned power cloaked in humility. And when it came, it wouldn't just rattle the staff. It would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew about legacy. Because tonight, the founder had returned, and this time she was watching. She stood near the edge of the grand lobby, perfectly still, like a statue carved from patience and memory. Vivian Cole didn't need to announce herself. She never had. For most of her life, silence had been her armor and her weapon, one sharpened by decades of being overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. And here she was again, in the heart of her own empire, bearing witness to how quickly people decide who matters and who doesn't. To the staff and the stream of wealthy patrons milling through the Baycrest Hotel that evening, she looked like an afterthought. No loud jewelry, no entourage, no signs of power as they had been taught to recognize it. But power, real power, doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it waits. And tonight, it was waiting in Vivian Cole's calm. Ava Sinclair watched from behind the front desk. Her eyes flicked toward the woman again. Something about the way she stood unsettled her. She didn't look lost, nor did she fidget or demand attention like so many entitled guests often did. There was a quiet certainty in her posture. Ava hated how that made her doubt herself. The name Vivian Cole still echoed in her mind, but it didn't align with the person she had turned away minutes earlier. It felt ridiculous, even dangerous, to consider that this woman, humble, simply dressed, patient to a fault, could be the same one who had founded the Baycrest Hotel empire. That woman was supposed to be fierce, glamorous, untouchable. Still, something gnawed at her. To shake the feeling, Ava turned to the hotel manager's office. "Derek?" she called softly. Derek Whitman looked up from his computer. He was the kind of man who never liked surprises, especially ones that threatened his rhythm of control. At 39, he had fought hard for his position at Baycrest and guarded it with a calculated precision. Reputation mattered. Appearances mattered more. "A woman at the desk," Ava said. "She claims she's Vivian Cole." Derek's brows lifted. Then he smirked. "Vivian Cole? That's a new one." "I know," Ava nodded, a little nervous. "But she said there's always a suite reserved for her." Derek stood, smoothing his navy blazer as he approached the desk. He wasn't worried. This was probably just another case of mistaken identity. Or worse, someone trying to take advantage of a legacy. They saw that often. People pretending to be connected to power, hoping it would get them past the velvet rope. Vivian turned as Derek approached. Their eyes met. He extended his hand with the confidence of a man used to being in charge. "Good evening, ma'am," he said smoothly. "I'm Derek Whitman, general manager. I hear there's been a bit of confusion." Vivian gave a small nod. "There's a suite reserved for me, always has been. I'm Vivian Cole." He hesitated. She said it so simply, so naturally, like she was stating her birth date or her favorite color. No edge, no arrogance, just fact. Derek smiled politely, masking his doubt. "I see. Well, unfortunately, we don't have a reservation under that name tonight, and we are fully committed. Perhaps another time." "I helped design that staircase," Vivian said, cutting him off gently. He paused. His eyes darted toward the staircase, then back to her. "I picked the artist who painted the mural in the East Wing. I debated for weeks over which chandelier should go in this lobby. I even rejected the first 3 sets of sofas for being too cold." She smiled faintly, her tone never rising. "I know every inch of this hotel, because I built it." Derek's polite expression began to stiffen. The words sounded rehearsed, he thought, convenient. Still, he needed to tread carefully. "I understand," he said, "but our policy requires a formal reservation, regardless of the circumstances. If you don't mind, I'll need to see some identification or documentation." Vivian didn't flinch. She didn't offer ID either. Instead, she just looked at him, not with defiance, but with the calm of someone who had been through far worse and survived it all. "I called someone. They'll handle it," she said, and turned slightly, glancing across the lobby with a kind of quiet detachment. Derek shifted uncomfortably. He hated loose ends. He hated guests who thought they could bend the system. He signaled one of the security guards near the concierge desk. "Just keep an eye," he murmured. Across the lobby, the shift in energy was subtle but real. A few guests noticed the older black woman standing alone, flanked now by 2 staff members who loomed close without speaking. Some whispered, others glanced away. A couple near the piano exchanged a look and leaned toward each other. "I think she's causing trouble," one of them muttered. I saw the manager come out, probably trying to scam a free night, the other replied. Vivian stood in the center of it all, not arguing, not defending, simply absorbing the weight of it. Her heart didn't race, not anymore. She had trained it not to, but it still ached. She remembered being 27, walking into a hotel conference in Miami, dressed in her best, her resume in hand, her head held high. The front desk clerk had smiled brightly, then handed her a housekeeping cart. "Here's your assignment for the day," he'd said. She had thanked him, rolled the cart into the elevator, and cried in silence all the way up to the 8th floor. Tonight wasn't all that different. The clothes were nicer, the chandeliers were more expensive. The judgment just wore better suits. Ava stood to the side, watching everything unravel. Doubt had fully taken root now, and guilt was not far behind. But she said nothing. She wasn't senior enough. Not yet. Derek checked his watch. "Let's not escalate," he whispered to the guards. "If she gets loud, then we move." Vivian heard him. Of course she did. Her hearing hadn't dulled. She chose not to respond. Instead, she studied the faces around her, the ones who ignored her, the ones who whispered, the ones who stared without shame. And for a moment, she let herself wonder, what would happen if I raised my voice? What if I demanded they pull every record, every floor plan, every press release with my name printed on it? What if I reminded them that none of this would exist without me? But she didn't. Because Vivian Cole had learned long ago that the most powerful voice isn't the one that yells, it's the one that makes others quiet. And they were quiet now, uncomfortable, restless, suddenly unsure of everything. The phone at the front desk rang. Ava picked it up. Her face changed. She turned to Derek, her voice shaking slightly. "It's Naomi Ellis. She's asking to speak with you." Derek's face tightened. He grabbed the receiver. "Naomi, good evening," he said quickly. "Yes, we're having a slight issue with a—" He stopped, his jaw clenched. Then he turned to look at Vivian again, really look. Suddenly, he saw it, the poise, the stillness, the quiet gravity that only comes from being tested and never breaking. Naomi's voice on the line was sharp, unforgiving. "That woman you're treating like a problem is the founder of our entire hotel chain. Do not speak. Do not defend. Just wait where you are. We're on our way." Derek lowered the phone, his face drained of color. Vivian hadn't moved. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stood still, unchanged, untouched. But the storm had already begun. Not the kind that breaks glass or floods rooms, the kind that rewrites memory, that turns whispered doubts into stunned silence, the kind that leaves behind one truth that no one can forget. They had judged the woman who built everything by the clothes on her back. And now they would remember her, not because she demanded it, but because she didn't have to. Time moved slowly in the lobby, thick with quiet tension and eyes that lingered too long. Vivian Cole stood near the marble column beside the reception desk, arms gently folded, her phone now tucked back inside her handbag. To the unknowing, she looked like a guest waiting for her ride or perhaps someone in the wrong place. But for those who had overheard enough, especially Derek Whitman and Ava Sinclair, an invisible storm was beginning to take shape around her presence. The silence grew heavier with every tick of the antique wall clock mounted above the concierge. Ava busied herself rearranging a stack of unused key cards. Derek stood stiffly by the desk, trying to look composed, but the tremor in his fingers betrayed him. Guests, staff, even security were caught in the stillness that now pulsed through the lobby like a current. Something was happening. They just didn't yet understand what. And then the elevator chimed. The doors opened with a soft whoosh, and out stepped Naomi Ellis, Senior Vice President of Operations, followed closely by Christopher Banks, the Regional Director for the Western Division. Both moved quickly, their expressions tense, breath shallow, footsteps sharp against the marble. They hadn't expected to be summoned this evening. Naomi had been reviewing quarterly performance reports in a suite upstairs, sipping herbal tea and preparing for a regional summit the next morning. Christopher was finalizing a presentation, half distracted by room service. But then, Naomi's phone buzzed, and everything changed. Now, as they entered the lobby and took in the scene, their eyes fell on Vivian. She stood alone, surrounded by two security guards and a growing pool of silent observers. Naomi stopped in her tracks. "Oh my God," she whispered, barely audible. "That's her." Christopher followed her gaze. His eyes widened. Vivian turned, meeting Naomi's stare. There was no smile on her face, just calm recognition. Naomi exhaled sharply and moved across the room with urgency, her heels striking the floor like warning bells. "Mrs. Cole," Naomi said, voice full of breath and disbelief. I I didn't know you were here. I had no idea. I am—" Vivian didn't answer. She simply nodded once, not in forgiveness, not in affirmation, just enough to signal that Naomi had arrived, and that everything else, the apologies, the excuses, the alarm in Naomi's voice, would need to wait. Christopher was right behind her, already reading the energy of the room. His instincts from years of executive leadership were screaming at him. A critical failure had occurred, and they were standing in the aftermath. The founder of the Baycrest Hotel had been mistaken for a trespasser. "Who authorized security?" he asked sharply, his gaze landing on Derek. Derek opened his mouth, searching for a response. I, we didn't know who she was. There was no reservation, no—" "Stop," Naomi said, holding up her hand. "Don't explain." The lobby was painfully quiet now. The front desk staff had frozen. Several guests were recording on their phones, others murmuring to one another behind raised hands. Naomi turned to Vivian again, this time her tone subdued, contrite. "Mrs. Cole, please allow us to escort you upstairs. Your suite will be ready immediately. I can assure you this will never happen again." Vivian looked at Naomi with a depth that made her shoulders sink. She wasn't angry, not in the way people expected. She was something else. Beyond anger, beyond disappointment, she was resolved. "I'm not here for the suite," she said, her voice gentle but strong. "I'm here to see what's become of what I built." Naomi's throat tightened. There was nothing to say to that, not yet. Vivian turned toward the staircase, where a single plaque still stood bearing her name, polished and small. She didn't need an escort. She began walking on her own, leaving Naomi, Christopher, and everyone else in the lobby behind like a shadow of the past they were now forced to confront. Ava's heart pounded. She remained frozen at the desk, watching as the woman she had doubted moved with the grace of someone who had survived too many moments like this to bother performing rage. It was worse than anger. It was the presence of truth, and it left nowhere to hide. Christopher stepped close to Derek, lowering his voice with visible restraint. "You had the founder of the company in your lobby, and you dismissed her. You treated her like a security concern." I I didn't recognize her," Derek whispered. "She didn't look like—" "Exactly," Christopher cut in. "She didn't look like what you expected. That's the problem." Derek's face went pale. Ava turned away, unable to make eye contact with anyone. A single thought looped in her mind. How could I have been so blind? Upstairs, Vivian entered the suite that had once been her personal space. The same suite where she hosted international guests, where she had closed million-dollar deals, where she had once toasted her first major expansion with trembling hands and a glass of sparkling water. It had changed. The furniture was different. The scent had shifted. But beneath it all, the bones of her vision remained. Naomi and Christopher entered behind her, both standing near the entrance like students waiting for a reprimand. "We're speechless," Christopher said softly. "There's no excuse for what happened. It was a complete failure, on every level." Vivian sat on the edge of the velvet armchair. She looked not at them, but out the window where the lights of San Francisco shimmered like stars caught in glass. "Do you know what it feels like," she said after a pause, "to be erased from something you created?" Neither of them answered. "I wasn't expecting red carpets," she continued, "or banners. I didn't come with cameras or headlines in my pocket. I came as a guest, not a founder, not a CEO, just a person. And still, that was too much." Naomi stepped forward. "You're right. Every word. And I can't express how sorry we are." "I'm not interested in apologies," Vivian said, turning to them. "What I care about is change." Christopher nodded, his jaw tight. "Then we begin tonight." Vivian stood. "Good. Because this hotel doesn't just bear my name, it bears my legacy, and I will not let it forget who it belongs to." And later that evening, as Vivian sat alone in the suite, the city stretching endlessly before her, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It read, "Ms. Cole, I'm Ava, the receptionist from earlier. I just wanted to say, I'm so sorry, and thank you for your grace. I've learned something tonight I'll never forget." Vivian stared at the screen for a long moment before turning it face down on the table. She didn't need the words, because she already knew. The call she made earlier wasn't just a call to correct a mistake. It was a call that exposed everything still broken. A call that reminded the entire system that no amount of prestige or marble walls could mask the deeper cracks beneath. And most of all, it was a call that set something in motion, something long overdue. Vivian Cole hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't demanded revenge, but the weight of her presence alone had turned a simple evening into a reckoning. Not just for Ava, not just for Derek, but for the entire industry that still confused wealth with worth, glamour with greatness, and silence with insignificance. Tonight she reminded them all, real power doesn't need to prove itself. It simply waits for the moment when truth speaks louder than anything else. The following morning, the city of San Francisco stirred awake under a soft blanket of fog. The Baycrest Hotel, still shimmering in its quiet prestige, bore little outward sign of the reckoning that had rippled through its marble halls the night before. The guests, many of whom had witnessed the scene in the lobby, moved about with an unspoken awareness. The name Vivian Cole now floated through whispered conversations and uncertain glances. For some, it was the name of a myth turned real. For others, it was a hard mirror reflecting truths they hadn't dared confront. Inside the executive boardroom on the 22nd floor, the atmosphere was thick. Naomi Ellis sat at the head of the long table, her fingers clasped tightly together. Christopher Banks leaned against the glass wall, staring down at the city below. Derek Whitman sat near the far end, his eyes hollowed by shame and restless thought. Ava Sinclair stood quietly in the back, her presence unannounced, uninvited, but permitted by Vivian herself. And then the door opened. Vivian entered not as a guest nor a figurehead, but as something else entirely, an architect of change. She walked with no notes, no assistant, no legal counsel, just her presence, just her voice. She took her place at the head of the table, directly across from Naomi. No one spoke. "I didn't come here today to relive last night," Vivian said, her tone clear, measured. "We all know what happened. What I care about is what happens now." Her gaze swept the room. No one could meet her eyes, not even Christopher. This hotel, this brand, was built with a promise, not just to be luxurious, not just to serve caviar and elegance, but to represent something better, inclusive, human, real, and last night we broke that promise. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Every sentence landed like a hammer, not out of force, but because it rang so undeniably true. "I built this company because I believed hospitality should mean something, not just service, but recognition. Not just smiles, but respect. And yet, when I walked through the front doors of my own creation, What I felt wasn't hospitality. It was exclusion. Quiet, polished, professional exclusion. A sharp breath escaped from Derek's lips, but he said nothing. He had already said too much by doing too little. Naomi finally spoke. You're right, and we take full responsibility for what happened. We failed not only you, but the core of what this place was supposed to represent. Vivian nodded. Then let's talk about fixing it. She reached into her bag and pulled out a single folder, thin, unassuming, but powerful. She placed it on the table and slid it toward Naomi. Inside was the framework for a new company-wide initiative, a full-scale reform that would impact every property bearing the Baycrest name. Training would go beyond service etiquette, beyond the bland corporate videos on inclusion. This would be personal, experiential, transformative. Project Humble Guest, Vivian explained. A permanent training track that recenters our values through storytelling, through lived experience, and through immersion. We teach our staff to serve not just by protocol, but by perception. Empathy, awareness. Naomi opened the folder slowly, flipping through the pages, handwritten notes, outlined modules, testimonial integration. She recognized instantly that this wasn't a PR stunt. This was a cultural reckoning dressed in quiet discipline. Christopher leaned forward. This isn't just good policy. This is mandatory. For all levels of staff. Vivian's gaze didn't waver. From the bellhop to the boardroom. She paused, then added, I'll be joining the training sessions. Not as an instructor, but as a participant. I want to listen, learn, share, and I expect each of you to do the same. Naomi's throat tightened. You have my full commitment. Christopher nodded. Mine as well. Derek looked up, struggling to speak, but Vivian turned to him before he could find his words. Derek, I don't want your apology. I want your accountability. Can you give me that? He swallowed. Yes, I can. Vivian studied him for a moment, then gave a single nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was the door to something harder. Earn trust. She stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. One more thing, she said. There's a new program I'll be overseeing myself. The Invisible Guest Initiative. No announcements. No warning. From this day forward, I or anyone I assign may arrive at any of our properties as ordinary guests. Not to catch people in the act, but to observe. To see what's real when no one's watching. The room remained silent. Everyone knew she wasn't threatening them. She was reminding them. Legacy was not marble and steel. It was how people behaved when no one was looking. Later that afternoon, in the quiet of the staff lounge, Vivian found Ava sitting alone at a small table by the window. Her back was straight, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her eyes staring blankly into the city outside. May I sit? Vivian asked softly. Ava turned, startled. She stood up quickly. Yes, of course. Ms. Cole, Vivian raised a gentle hand. Vivian, please. They sat across from one another in silence for a moment. I wanted to thank you, Ava said, voice barely above a whisper. Vivian tilted her head, curious. For what? For not humiliating me. For teaching me. For letting me learn the hard way, but not breaking me in the process. Vivian smiled, just a little. I didn't need to break you. You were already cracking open. That's when real growth happens. Ava's eyes filled with tears. I was wrong. Everything I thought I knew about what success looked like, what respect looked like. I was wrong. Vivian reached across the table and placed a hand on hers. We've all been wrong, Ava. I have too. But what matters is what we do next. Don't waste your regret. Turn it into resolve. Ava nodded, wiping her eyes. I will. I promise. Vivian stood, slowly. Then I trust you, because you're not the same woman who stood behind that desk yesterday. As she left, Ava pulled a small envelope from her coat pocket. She had written it the night before, after lying awake for hours, her mind replaying every glance, every word, every mistake. She tucked it beneath Vivian's coffee cup and returned to her quiet window. That evening, in her suite, Vivian opened the envelope. The letter was simple, humble, filled with remorse, but also hope. It ended with these words: "Thank you for letting me see. Thank you for not walking away. I will carry this with me, not as guilt, but as fuel. You reminded me of the person I want to be." Vivian folded the letter and held it against her chest. She wasn't here to punish. She was here to plant something that could last. And finally, for the first time in a long time, she believed it would. The week that followed felt different at the Baycrest Hotel. Even if the walls, the lighting, and the floor plan remained the same. It wasn't a change you could touch or point to exactly, but it was there. In the way people spoke more softly, in the way employees looked longer into guests' eyes before they asked, "How can I help you?" It was in the subtle urgency of self-reflection, a collective breath being held, as though everyone had begun to understand the weight of what had passed through their lobby. Vivian Cole stayed on for several more days, not as a supervisor, not as a guest, but as a quiet observer. She didn't demand meetings. She didn't call press conferences. She walked the halls, paused in forgotten corners of the building, exchanged words with housekeepers and junior staff. She listened to voices that rarely reached executive ears, and those ears were listening now. Project Humble Guest had already begun its rollout, and Naomi Ellis ensured that the Baycrest staff would be the pilot team. Training modules went live, one shaped not just by statistics or bland HR policy, but by real moments. Derek Whitman, now visibly more subdued, volunteered to lead the first round of trainings himself. It wasn't penance, it was commitment. Ava Sinclair changed the most. She no longer stood behind the desk as someone eager to control a moment. Instead, she approached each interaction as if it held a story waiting to be uncovered. She listened first. She paused longer. She carried in her pocket a small note she'd written to herself after her private conversation with Vivian. "Respect walks softly. So must I." One afternoon, as Vivian was walking past the reception desk, she noticed Ava gently guiding an elderly couple who had just arrived. The man was hard of hearing. The woman looked tired. Ava crouched slightly as she spoke, her voice warm, not rehearsed. She didn't rush them. She made sure they understood everything. She smiled in a way that felt earned, not performed. Vivian paused at a distance, watching. She saw not just growth, but intention. She saw a young woman who had faced herself and decided not to run. Later that evening, Ava approached her in the hotel cafe, holding a second letter. "I know I already wrote one," she said nervously, "but I needed to say thank you again. Not just for what you taught me, for who you are." Vivian took the envelope gently. "What you do with that lesson matters more than what I gave you." "I know," Ava replied. "That's why I joined the mentorship circle. We're starting it next month, just a few of us. I want to help new staff learn to see people, not just serve them." Vivian smiled, a quiet pride swelling behind her ribs. "Then you're already doing more than most." That night, Vivian returned to her suite, opened Ava's second letter, and read it slowly, line by line. It was no longer just an apology. It was a reflection, a promise. And tucked inside the envelope was a printed quote: "Hospitality is not about perfection. It's about presence." The next morning, Vivian stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive meeting room. The sun had just crested over the bay, turning the water into gold. Behind her, the top leaders of the hotel chain gathered, each carrying laptops and documents, their expressions more serious than usual. Thomas Reed, the chairman of the board, stood as she turned. His face was taut with concern, but his voice carried deference. "Vivian," he began, We understand this has been a wake-up call. Whatever you need, budget, structure, staffing, we're prepared to commit. Vivian stepped forward slowly. Her voice was low, firm. I don't need promises. I need transformation. She took a deep breath and continued. What happened last week was not a misstep. It was the result of a mindset that has quietly shaped this industry for decades. You think hospitality is about elegance, exclusivity, perfection, but it's not. It's about dignity, recognition, the ability to walk into a space and be treated like you matter, no matter who you are or how you look. Her words settled in the room like stones dropped into water. Ripples of discomfort moved across faces, but also clarity, understanding. This hotel was built to be a home for every kind of traveler: the rich, the modest, the lost, the dreamer, the unassuming. And we failed that vision. We failed it because we started worshiping appearance over presence, position over personhood. Naomi nodded slowly. So what do? We start at the root, Vivian answered. We re-educate, not just train, not just adjust. We rebuild how people think, not just how they serve. We make every employee, from top to bottom, experience what it means to feel unseen. And then we show them what it means to be truly seen. Thomas Reed leaned forward. You're saying we disrupt the system? Vivian's smile was faint but resolute. I'm saying we become the kind of company worth admiring, not for its architecture, but for its ethics. The room erupted into action. Plans formed. Leadership pledged direct involvement. Regional directors drafted communication templates. Vivian's blueprint became the foundation for the most meaningful cultural overhaul the brand had ever attempted. And she didn't stop there. 2 weeks later, she traveled quietly to a university in Oakland to speak to a room of first-generation business students. Her talk wasn't about how to build empires. It was about how to carry yourself in rooms not built for you, about how to survive being underestimated, about how to rise with grace instead of anger. You don't need to prove anything to people who are committed to misunderstanding you, she told them. Just keep building. One day, they'll walk into what you created and not even realize it was yours. Back at the Bay Crest, a new plaque was installed near the grand staircase. It read, Founded with dignity, sustained by respect, in honor of Vivian Cole. But Vivian herself never paused to look at it. She didn't need symbols. She was watching for substance. One early morning, as she prepared to leave the hotel for what might be the last time in a long while, she took a final walk through the lobby. The staff greeted her warmly, not because they had been instructed to, but because they wanted to. Their eyes held recognition now, not of a founder, but of a human being they admired. Near the corner, Ava stood beside a new employee, showing him how to arrange guest keys. She looked up, saw Vivian, and smiled. Not a hesitant smile, a proud one. Vivian returned it with a nod. Outside, the city was waking. Streetcars rumbled. Fog lifted slowly off the bay. And as Vivian stepped into her waiting car, she didn't look back at the building she had once fought so hard to bring into the world. She didn't need to. Because legacy isn't in the marble, it's in the change that follows you, in the people who stop assuming, in the eyes that learn to see differently, in the stories that grow stronger than the silence that once erased them. Vivian Cole didn't leave behind a hotel, she left behind a movement. And as the car turned the corner, disappearing into the misty San Francisco morning, she whispered to herself a quiet truth she had carried for a lifetime. You don't need to shout to be heard. Just walk with self-respect, and no one can take away your true value. Vivian Cole's story isn't just one of triumph. It is a masterclass in restraint, resilience, and radical dignity in the face of deeply embedded bias. It's about a woman who rose quietly, not with the noise of fame, but with the steady rhythm of character. It's about a legacy built not on applause, but on principles. And most powerfully, it's about what happens when that legacy is challenged, not by accident, but by the quiet virus of assumption. From the very first moment she stepped out of that black sedan and onto the curb outside the Baycrest Hotel, Vivian carried more than just a handbag. She carried decades of sacrifice, of memories, of a life carved through the stone of adversity. She walked into the lobby of her own creation not to be seen, but simply to be. And that was precisely what made her invisible. This wasn't the first time she had been overlooked. As a young woman of color in an industry obsessed with image, Vivian had endured 1,000 small humiliations. Being mistaken for the help, being silenced in boardrooms, being ignored at networking events. And yet, she had built a legacy. She had designed an empire. But success, as she would later learn, is not an impenetrable shield. It doesn't inoculate you from prejudice. It simply delays its return. And when it comes back, it often comes softly, in the form of a polite smile that carries disbelief, a professional tone that masks dismissal, a refusal spoken in the name of protocol, not truth. When the receptionist Ava turned Vivian away, it wasn't malice. It was something more dangerous, unconscious bias. The belief that power must look a certain way, dress a certain way, act a certain way. Ava didn't see a founder because Vivian didn't perform like one. And that was the first fracture. Then came Derek Whitman, the manager, whose authority was built on control. Faced with a situation that challenged his assumptions, he chose to escalate. Security was called. Protocol was enforced. Dignity was pushed aside. But Vivian, she didn't fight. She didn't raise her voice or flash credentials. She made a quiet call, and that call became a mirror that forced an entire institution to look at itself, honestly, uncomfortably, and without excuse. When Naomi Ellis and Christopher Banks entered the lobby that night and saw the woman standing between two guards, the woman who had given their careers a foundation, they didn't just see their failure. They saw their forgetfulness. They saw how easily they had let an industry built on hospitality become a machine of discrimination dressed in politeness. Yet Vivian didn't demand retribution. She demanded responsibility. She didn't seek revenge. She insisted on reform. In the days that followed, she didn't sit back and accept apologies. She rolled up her sleeves and started a movement. Project Humble Guest, the Invisible Guest Initiative, a cultural reset for a company that had strayed from its roots. She walked into staff meetings not with fury, but with facts. She didn't shame Ava. She mentored her. She didn't fire Derek. She gave him the choice to rebuild what he had broken. And most significantly, she taught everyone that transformation doesn't begin with punishment. It begins with awareness. Vivian knew that one incident wouldn't fix everything, but she also knew that every fire starts with a spark. And that spark, her presence, her patience, her power, lit something irreversible. Ava didn't just learn to be a better receptionist. She became a mentor, a mirror for others, a reminder that seeing someone truly means seeing their story. Derek became a student of his own shortcomings. Naomi and Christopher rewrote policies that had once lived on paper but now pulsed with meaning. And Vivian? She didn't need a title to reclaim her space. She didn't need her name in gold letters, because what she created lived not in the logo, but in the shift, in the eyes that now searched more deeply, in the tone of voice that softened, in the way new hires were trained not just to follow rules, but to carry empathy. Her legacy didn't hang on a wall. It lived in behavior. In a world that often measures value by volume, how loudly we speak, how boldly we dress, how visibly we shine, Vivian Cole reminded us that true value moves differently. It doesn't beg to be seen. It walks with confidence in its own truth. It demands recognition, not through force, but through consistency. So what do we learn from her journey? First, we learn that power does not always look like power. It doesn't always wear heels or suits. It doesn't always walk with a publicist or sit behind a nameplate. Sometimes it wears a scarf and carries a weathered leather bag. And if we judge too quickly, we might miss it entirely. Second, we learn that prejudice is rarely loud anymore. It hides in civility, in the assumption that kindness and fairness are the same, in the belief that professional language justifies exclusion. But bias, when wrapped in politeness, is still bias, and it still wounds. Third, we learn that change begins when we're willing to see the uncomfortable parts of ourselves. Ava's growth didn't start when she apologized. It started when she sat with her guilt and chose not to run from it. Derek's transformation began not in a meeting, but in a moment of silence, when he realized that his pride had cost someone their humanity. And most importantly, we learned that legacy isn't marble and glass. It's not square footage or profit margins. It's how a place makes people feel. It's how we show up for others when no one is watching. It's the stories we leave behind and how we treat the forgotten, the unassuming, the quiet. Vivian didn't just reclaim her place, she redefined what it meant to belong. Now, as you reflect on this story, ask yourself, where have you looked without seeing? Where have you assumed without asking? Where have you followed the rules instead of honoring what's right? Because the world doesn't need more rules. It needs more reflection. It needs people like Vivian, those who carry change in their presence, not their pitch. People who understand that dignity isn't something you earn through wealth. It's something we're all owed as human beings. So in your everyday life, at your workplace, in your home, on the street, remember this. Don't assume the stranger next to you has nothing to teach you. Don't confuse silence with weakness. Don't mistake humility for insignificance. Because the person you overlook today might just be the one who built the space you now call home. And if you're ever in a position to offer kindness or judgment, choose kindness. It costs nothing, but it changes everything. Vivian Cole's story is not just about a hotel. It's about the quiet power of self-respect. It's about what happens when you don't need to shout to be heard. And if her story moved you, if it made you reflect, if it cracked open something you've been carrying without knowing, then carry this forward. Share this story. Talk about it. Live it. Let it challenge the way you see the world. And if you believe stories like this matter, if you believe in the power of quiet revolutions, in dignity over display, in stories that make us better, then support this channel by subscribing. Your support gives us the fuel to bring more meaningful stories like Vivian's to life. Stories that aren't just entertainment, but transformation. So hit that subscribe button, leave us your thoughts in the comments, and let's build a community where self-respect, empathy, and integrity are celebrated, one story at a time. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.